All right, I already have my name chosen for the next league. GGG Baja blasted my mana. Hi, it's Lerald, and I'm going to talk about how patch 3.24 has changed my Toxic Rain Pathfinder League start build, but before I do, don't forget to like and subscribe. I have updated the path of building in the old video and linked it in the description for this one as well, so if you just want that, you know where to find it. Now let's just kind of get right into things. And let's not start with the bad news. Let's start by looking at the cool new belt that GGG announced that they are adding to the Uber Shaper drop pool, the Tides of Time. I already have that pulled up into my path of building here, and like this is my standard path of building here, 1800 life per second, looks pretty good, all great stuff. If we use the Tides of Time, that goes up to 2900 life per second from life flasks. That's insane, but there is even more. Not just 2900 life per second compared to the like pretty juicy Stygian Vice here. As we can see, the uptime on some of these flasks isn't exactly 100. 93% average on this Quicksilver flask, 69% nice. Percent average on the silver flask. That's with kind of doing like not everything we possibly could in this kill tree to get uptime and counting on killing some guys to get uptime. So that just goes straight up to 100% for the Quicksilver flask and 100% average for the silver flask as opposed to the 69 that it was at. Insane, right? Insane for uptime. It basically turns whatever you're playing into a Pathfinder, but then it also has this incredible synergy with Pathfinder. And unlike Mageblood, which is still better because Mageblood you can use enkindling orbs on all of the flasks. You know, they have guaranteed uptime no matter what, and so you can then use enkindling orbs on them to give them an extra 70% increased effect. That is better than 25% increased effect, obviously. Also, the implicit on this stinks. Like, you're going to want to double corrupt this ultimately and try to fish for good alpha implicits, or I should say run alpha temples and try to fish for good vol implicits. But you know, that's really the only downside is the base type is terrible. Presumably this is going to be way more available than Mageblood because it is so like build specific. It is very much them pandering to Pathfinders as they also make a big nerf. Okay, let's move on to what is not changing for this build, and we're going to start with kind of the basics of Toxic Rain. Now, I don't want to just run through like all of the same information I did in the last build guide that hasn't changed, but I do want to at least show what hasn't changed. So, Toxic Rain is still the same skill. The leveling guide, the whole leveling campaign, so on, is exactly the same. So like just going right through it very quickly. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, totally unchanged. Nothing different literally there at all. Not one thing. Basically everything up through at minimum your first 2 void stones, totally the same. The build is pretty much the same as it was before until you reach the highest levels of gearing. And for me, I would say that my league start is actually unaffected through 4 void stones. For a lot of players, they may start Toxic Rain Pathfinder, get their 4 Void Stones, and then move on to another build at that point. So this set of changes that happen with flasks might literally not affect those people at all, and that is good. Okay, now let's get on to the bad news and how it affects the build and how I've changed the build to account for it. The first change is the removal of left mouse button to auto cast instant skills while moving. This is annoying, but it's fine. I am moving Withering Step and Immortal Call into an automation support setup, probably, and that fixes everything. I think the only problem I have with that is automation support isn't in PoE right now, and I don't really know how it's going to feel. I might not actually not wind up liking it and not go with it, but you know, we'll see about that. I might still just like I might just move Withering Step to a different keybind and just hit it by hand. Not thrilled about the possibility of that, but I think that is a possibility. Additionally, hidden in the patch notes, kind of deep, but very important, GGG dropped a huge nerf to Toxic Rain Pathfinder and basically every Pathfinder and Mageblood build that's deep into the endgame. They've removed the Veiled Flask modifier, this right here, that reduces the mana cost of skills. It is gone from the game, and they also removed the Jewel modifier that reduced mana cost of skills. That's also gone. This means that you 100% cannot use Divine Blessing support while using a mana setup, anymore, so the existing in-game build that used Divine Blessing and Manaforged arrows has to be rethought. You have to make some sacrifices somewhere. You either have to use Eldritch Battery in order to continue using Divine Blessing and then give up Manaforged arrows, or you have to give up that aura, shift your auras around, make really huge sacrifices to lower your mana cost, and then you can continue using Manaforged arrows. So fortunately, there are a lot of ways to fix these problems. We've dealt with mana issues in the past, and we can do it again. And rather than just give like one solution to the problem or saying, here's 10 ways to fix it and figure them out yourself, I wanted to give several directions that I think you can steer the build once you reach the end game. Okay, let's start from the basic early mapping setup. So let's actually go to this right here. This is all the same, all fine. You're going to be running Eldritch Battery for doing your first Uber Lab, getting your Atlas started. You're going to continue using Eldritch Battery and some energy shield and evasion gear. You're going to be doing that for a while up into like farming into the 90s and getting your void stones. And you're just going to continue doing that even until you've gotten your cluster jewels set up and your gear is starting to take off. Your damage is starting to take off. You're thinking about taking down Uber Elder and Maven. You're just going to be rocking with Eldritch Battery. No problem. One thing I didn't mention in the previous video is that you can run a belt. I think I have one here. Here we go. You can run a belt with this crafted suffix on it, regenerate 150 energy shield per second while a rare or unique enemy is nearby. This is really helpful for just making it so that as you get up to a 6 link and as your attack speed starts increasing and your energy shield consumption per second starts going up, you know, as long as you're fighting a rare or unique enemy, any sort of situation where you're in combat for a long time and you might be running out of energy shield, that's completely invalidated just by having this. The downside to this is that it is a belt suffix, so that makes getting 2 great flask modifiers on your belt and then having room to craft this as a suffix is a little harder. And that's okay. I think ultimately the goal is not to run a rare belt. I think ultimately your goal is either going to be to run like a Tides of Time or a Headhunter or a Mage Blood, but I think Tides of Time becomes kind of a catch-all for Pathfinders, depending on how available it is and how expensive it is. Now, it could wind up being way more expensive than I'm thinking it'll be, and so maybe that's not the case. Maybe you just wind up sticking with like a good old crafted Stygian Vice, and that certainly can work as well. Certainly a lot more budget option, right? A couple divines on a crafted rare belt as opposed to like, I'm guessing a double-digit number of divines on a unique belt from an Uber boss. Now, there are several other things you can do to fix your mana as well. Obviously, you've got Eldritch Battery, so you can use this Energy Shield Mastery. If you have a helmet that has a lot of Energy Shield on it, this will give you a ton more Energy Shield. And since it's basically filling the role of mana, that kind of fixes a lot of your problems. You can also take this Life Mastery. It converts 30% of your mana cost into life cost, which helps out a lot. You know, you're going to be spending like a maybe 15 to 20 life per cast, so about 100 life per second or so. That really gets invalidated by your life flask, like pretty easily. Even without the Tides of Time, you're still going to be over 1500 life per second very comfortably. Well over 1500 life per second, probably, with a decent setup. So cutting 100 life per second or so, you know, that's not really that big of a cost. Then you have 2 options for our second main link of skill gems. Now you have Toxic Rain as your main setup. That's going to be Toxic Rain with Void Manipulation, Vicious Proj, Mirage Archer, Efficacy, and then Empower as the preferred 6th option. The same setup as before, basically. And then you have 2 options. You can use a Toxic Rain Ballista support with Focus Ballista support to help focus down bosses and tanky rares, and otherwise you would just use Toxic Rain as like a 1-button build to run around, clear all the maps, and just have the same gameplay loop that we've had for a while. And, you know, I don't love setting down totems, but the fact that you're only setting them down for specifically tanky rares and bosses, and you're not really having to recast them. They're really just there for, like, as we can see from this set of, it's only a 5 link, it's not even a 6 link. They're really there just to make sure that Wither is at 15 stacks all the time, and also apply Cull on high health enemies so you don't have to do 10% of their health. You know, it adds a good bit of damage just to have that. So I don't think that's too inconvenient. I think it works a lot better, or at least it is a more satisfying gameplay loop for me than the straight Toxic Rain Ballista setup, where you're just throwing these down as sort of an extra buff, but it is still a little bit less convenient than Manaforged arrows, right? So there is another alternative, Caustic Arrow. Caustic Arrow is a very powerful clearing skill, but it's terrible for single target damage because the pools don't overlap. Enemies can only take damage from one Caustic Arrow pool at a time. Like visually they overlap, but right, you can only do damage with one Caustic Arrow pool to each enemy at a time, so it's great for clearing, but terrible for pure single target. You can use Vol Caustic Arrow as a really powerful clear skill against big packs as well, so it's really, really good. And I have set up a Caustic Arrow setup here. It's also very satisfying to look at, as you can see. And so you mostly build Caustic Arrow the same way that you build Toxic Rain, so you can just use Arrow Nova support to make it just kind of screen clear like so. And then it's this absolute powerhouse for clearing maps. It actually clears quite a lot faster than the standard Toxic Rain build. And then what you do is you use Toxic Rain just often enough to keep your Mirage Archer going all the time and to kill rares and bosses. And this is a thing that is a pretty well established build by this point. I think I started seeing this pop up during Crucible League, and I have played around with it and I do really like it. There is one thing you want from your gear for Caustic Arrow that you don't normally care about for Toxic Rain, and I'll show that off here. It is a glove implicit. It can also come from a Hunter Quiver prefix, but I would rather have the glove implicit, and that is projectiles pierce an additional target. So getting a bit of pierce from Caustic Arrow is really, it's not absolutely mandatory, but it is pretty important because as you see, these arrows go out, and if they hit an enemy, they'll stop and drop on the ground and drop a pool there. But if they have pierce, they will pierce through the first enemy, drop a pool through the enemy they pierced, and then continue on until they hit another enemy or hit the end of their travel time and drop a pool there. So you can get twice as many pools potentially and just fully cover the screen in pools all the time, while also having your Toxic Rain, both self-cast or auto-casting through Mirage Archer, but then also whenever you do hit any sort of rare enemy, any sort of tanky enemy, really, you're just sitting there also dropping a million Toxic Rain pods on their face, while the Caustic Arrows are just kind of sitting around the room clearing everything that's walking around, and white mobs and simple magic mobs are just dying based on the CAs that you filled the room with. There are really only two downsides to this approach. The first one, 2 keybinds. You do have to have a separate keybind for Caustic Arrow and Toxic Rain. That is a little inconvenient, and that is probably the only thing I really dislike about it compared to running the Toxic Rain within Toxic Rain Ballista support just for taking down rares, is that you are having to actually use 2 different keybinds, but you get a lot more room, you get a lot more screen clear, which is pretty nice. I find that I actually am clearing maps faster using this Caustic Arrow setup than I was with straight Toxic Rain. And then number 2, it's weaker for bossing. It just does a lot less damage than the Ballistas. So with that being said, it is great for clear, and I will do a demo here if I have a map, a bog map. Okay, and just to kind of spoil this before I go in, I'm using a level 1 Arrow Nova, a level 1 Void Manipulation, and a level 1 Vicious Proj. I do have pretty good gear, obviously, and I have a 21 or level 20 Vol Caustic Arrow, but I can even take off the Silver Flask just to kind of demo. I also removed the charm that I had that was giving me chance to explode. I got rid of that as well, just so that I wasn't getting any free explodes and then making that kind of juice my damage. So all of my charms don't have any sort of explode on them. And so as we can see, this is what level 1 supports. Maybe the magic mobs will take a little bit longer to kill, but we're flying, right? And we're just killing everything off screen, on screen, whatever. It's fine. And then, okay, let's try not to die. But as you can see, this is with a very suboptimal set of supports. I do have awakened support, so if we throw all those if we throw our supports on the ground, we lose them. If we throw in some of the actual nice supports here, and again, I think I just have this on a 5-link still, the damage really, really climbs. But it really just doesn't take a lot of damage to clear maps out. Ultimately, 1 million DPS for clearing maps is usually fine for a lot of tier 16 content. And this does well over 1 million DPS, even with kind of mid gear, substantially over with really good gear, and an actual 6-link setup. So I think this works pretty well. And as you can see, I'm not having to like stop and pop every single pack of dudes along the way like I was with the much tighter radius on Toxic Rain. So it is kind of a faster, zoomier clear for the most part. And then you just stop and pick off the fancy boys along the way and then keep going. I think this boss room is kind of a good example here. We Toxic Rain down the boss, but as you know, very easily just clip through all the rest of the dudes. Okay, so that's a sample map. In my opinion, this is the best possible setup for the build now, and I think that just using Eldritch Battery permanently to make this setup work is the correct approach. This has really beautiful synergy with a Headhunter build as well. I have that in Standard League, and I'm going to switch over to that, a Standard League version of this that is using Headhunter and a Devouring Diadem, and we'll show that off. The ideal 6 link for this is, and I have it pulled up here, the ideal 6 link is a Vol Caustic Arrow, Awakened Vicious Proj, Awakened Void Manipulation, Awakened Arrow Nova, Awakened Swift Affliction, and Awakened, well, I guess Awakened Empower, but you know, that's like regular Empower will work just fine. You don't need Awakened Gems for this to work. You do not need level 4 Empower. They make it better, but they are not required by any stretch. You don't need to put this on a 6 link even. It can work on a 4 link or a 5 link, but you know, obviously it's going to be better the more links that you have. There are a couple of ways to make your Eldritch Battery work at high gear levels when your mana costs start getting higher and your attack speed increases. I already mentioned using the Life Mastery and the Belt Suffix. Those are both really good. You want to be sure that your Malevolence Divine Blessing support is linked to an Inspiration support, and you want to make sure that that Inspiration support has quality so that it will reduce the mana cost even further. Like the Inspiration support at level 20 will give you 34% reduced mana cost, and then the quality will give you another 5. If you can get it to 21, if you can somehow get your hands on a 21, corrupt it up to that, then that'll give you 35%, so a total of 40% reduced mana cost. That's pretty helpful. If you take the, like I'll swap this Life Mastery out for life costs mana instead, and as you can see, my Malevolence now costs about 250 life in addition to 300 mana, so kind of expensive. This is a Standard League character. I don't even have a second flask, and I just have Taste of Hate and then a Silver Flask and a Quicksilver Flask. I don't have any sort of mana cost on this at all, and as you can see here, I am using my favorite way to fix mana, Devouring Diadem. It's back from the grave. You get this from Katarina. It basically fixes mana single-handedly. It grants Eldritch Battery, so that saves you some passive points, and it provides a massive amount of Energy Shield, which synergizes really well with that Energy Shield Mastery. If you need it, it may be overkill, especially if you're going with the life mana cost converted into life node. Like that may not be required, but it is definitely an option. Now, Diadem is really nice for a lot of reasons. I mean, I've already mentioned kind of the big ones, but it also casts Feast of Flesh every 5 seconds. Feast of Flesh will eat nearby corpses to restore a lot of life, energy, shield, and mana. So I've had that save my life a ton of times where I'm at 20% health and then I'm at full health now because Feast of Flesh triggered. Feels good. It also grants both +1 to gem levels and 25% increased mana res efficiency to socketed gems. So it turns a level 3 Enlighten, I think it's this one, yep, into a level 4 Enlighten. And it also basically gives you about, what is that, about a level like 6 Enlightens worth of mana reservation efficiency on the other skills that are in here, which is a lot of mana reservation efficiency. This allows you to fit in something else like a Defiance banner somewhere else in your gear. It's really good. I think on this character, I have Aspect of the Spider, and I have thrown that into the build. I haven't put too much information on it because it's not that huge of a damage increase, and it really does require getting a lot of mana reservation efficiency elsewhere to fit that in, but it gives you like 7% more damage or something. Very high-end optimization that I don't actually think is worth the cost. Fitting the banner in can be challenging because you're tight on sockets. That's actually the biggest concern I have with that, is fitting in banner on this build, which I made a long time ago. I just didn't run a Mortal Call. I don't really think that's the right move. I don't have it in the current Path of Building setup. I think ultimately you're either going to have to choose between like self-casting a Mortal Call or dropping Blood Rage in order to fit in a banner. I think dropping Blood Rage is safer for mapping, especially if you're doing blue Eldritch Altar farming. I don't think it has a huge impact on your mapping speed. And also, it means you won't generate frenzy charges, which is like, that's bad for damage, but then it's actually good because you don't have to deal with the blue Eldritch Altar frenzy charge downsides, which can reduce like all of your energy shield. Like if you take the frenzy charge downside where frenzy charges reduce your defenses and then you have a bunch of frenzy charges, you will have no energy shield and you won't be able to use any skills. So that is something to be aware of. All right, so I am now on my standard league character here, and I'm going to show this setup off in a map. And I just have a, all right, T16 Acid Caverns map, sure. I have not leveled this Caustic Arrow up. It's like level 14, so it's really not ready for prime time at the moment. But I'm going to show off just the Toxic Rain clearing with this at the very least. And as you can see from the energy shield, like this is working fine. This is completely smooth. I'm not having any problems at all with keeping my energy shield up. No issues whatsoever. Now, like I said, the Caustic Arrow that I have is not leveled, so I could try tapping stuff with it, but I don't think it's going to do much. Surprisingly more than I expected. I think it actually is kind of killing some stuff, even though it's only like level 12 or level 11 or something. But yeah, not as good as Toxic Rain when it's massively underleveled. As you can see also from this build, I am wearing a Headhunter. So like Headhunter definitely does work on this build, especially because we're using Energy Shield, Eldritch Battery, Energy Shield as our mana pool. We are sometimes running into situations where we might get like a massive increase to attack speed from Headhunter. That can maybe make things a little sketchy, but more often we get massive energy shield from Headhunter, which is basically all upside. Just gives us like, imagine if you just suddenly had like an extra 2,000 mana to play with. Okay, easy. I really like Diadem. It prevents you from using a rare helmet, and that has several downsides, but it also has all the upsides I've already mentioned, and it also makes it so that you can do no regen maps easily because you don't regen, you recover energy shield. And so you're just completely able to do no regen maps. It's fine. Just like your life flask all counts as recovery. So you have no issues with no regen at all. Okay, here are the downsides though. No AoE from your helm prefix. That you have to fix that somehow. You also get no Eldritch Implicits on your helm. Obviously, it's a unique. And you get no evasion, so you cannot use this evasion mastery to help fix your suppression easy. All of these are fixable. So what we want is we want AoE from two sources on our gear so that we land in the sweet spot of around 39% AoE to get perfect overlaps on all 5 of our pods. The actual amount of AoE that we need is between 37 and 43%, not exactly 39% specifically, but 39 is like a good rule of thumb. This is taken from a PoE builds post, a Reddit post, so I will link that in the description as well as the path of building. And we can just use an AoE prefix on our amulet. Now, I am running a very silly build that I used to screw around with back when we still had different alternate quality gems. I used to use Phantasmal Toxic Rain with a Ashes of the Stars. It would give you like 5 or 6 extra pods, and so you could like cover the screen. The single target damage was very bad, but you could basically clear about at the same rate as you can with just using Caustic Arrow. So I do not have a crafted neck on this character, but I do have one in the gear setup in the path of building, and this is something that I used in the last league when I was playing around with Devouring Diadem early on in the league, and this worked extremely well. Just an AoE neck, like +1 to skill gems, maybe you get a damage over time multiplier, you just have some stats fixing things, and then you craft increased area of effect on your amulet, you have it on your gloves, and you're still okay on area of effect. You lose the helm area of effect, but that's really not the end of the world. So what about the Eldritch Implicits though? The main purpose of the Eldritch Implicits on a rare helm, like if I show off a rare helm here, it's mainly about fixing mana. And, as we can see here, one is for mana reservation efficiency of skills. This is just strictly worse, even with the mana res efficiency implicit and suffix, this is still worse for mana than the Diadem. And the reduced mana cost of attacks is really only there to help us, be able to use our mana pool. And as we can see from Diadem, it totally trivializes mana. So we could just stick with Diadem on that front as well. Now, losing spell suppression from the evasion mastery is kind of a bummer. You know, losing this point here is kind of a bummer. But at the end of the day, you can just fix that by getting some more suppression on your gloves or your boots. And then it kind of frees up a passive point. So it's really not that terrible. I've cooked up a tree using a second cluster jewel, and specifically using Diadem up in the top half of the tree here to show off what I think the in-game version of this setup would look like. I think it's pretty nice with it, to be honest, and I think you could reasonably take down high-end, like, juiced mapping and Ubers with this setup. I will just say I've taken down Ubers with a Diadem and this setup right here. Well, not Eldritch Battery and a Diadem, but with this basic setup. And it's, I mean, they're Ubers. They're not trivially easy, but it wasn't like that hard. So I think that doing a setup like this, where you have an extra cluster jewel and you have really just a lot of extra damage, you know, you're also using the Diadem to fix all of your mana problems. I think it's fine. I think it will work very well for in-game. Okay, so if you're fine with not using Manaforged arrows, this is kind of a stopping point for the build. Now, there's potentially some optimization you could make to this tree, but I think generally speaking, at this point, you can take down Ubers, you can take down basically all of the end game with a setup like this and pretty good gear. And there's always room to add more power onto the build. That is what I'm going to do. I probably will go until I have either a Tides of Time, the new belt, or Headhunter or Mageblood, something like that. Maybe all three, I don't know. But you really don't need to make any huge changes from this point onward. As for whether you need to stick with a Devouring Diadem permanently, you don't. You can craft a really juicy evasion energy shield helm and transition out of using Diadem, but you will need to pick up a lot of energy shield elsewhere in your gear, whether it's from jewels or on other armor slots to compensate. Potentially you could come through this right side here even and like get at some of these nodes like Blood Drinker and this jewel spot here, and then drop all of these travel nodes that you're taking up here, and potentially even drop Instinct and all of this stuff here, like these travel nodes to get over there. And you would have to make that up with spell suppression elsewhere, but that is something you could do to maybe optimize some points elsewhere and give yourself the ability to pick up skills cost life instead of mana cost to help alleviate not running Diadem anymore. It is an option. I think it's very high budget, and I don't really know how much more value you actually gain out of it compared to just running Diadem, which in the past has been a somewhat expensive. You know, you might spend 5 divines on a Diadem early on, but compared to a helm that you might spend double-digit divines crafting, I think that Diadem is relatively cheap and it solves all your problems for you without really being all that expensive. Now, one thing I didn't mention about Diadem is what veiled modifiers you want on it. You really only have 2 sets of options that are particularly good. You can get one of the elemental resistances in Chaos. Any of them are fine. Or you can get Strength and Int. You could also get like Int and Dex or Strength and Dex, but Strength and Int is really like the best as far as stats go. Lightning and Chaos Res is probably the best as far as resistances go. I would say, just thinking about it off the top of the dome, stats are probably better than resistances. You can get a lot more resistances elsewhere, kind of easier to make up than stats. It is kind of hard to get enough strength in this build. I've kind of tweaked some gear to give myself a bunch of strength and int, but normally speaking, that is actually kind of hard to get going. So I would say strength int on the Diadem is probably the best. Lightning Chaos Res, very close second. In terms of transitioning out of Diadem and into a rare helm, I think it's doable. It just puts a lot more pressure on all of the rest of your armor to have good stats across the board. Basically, like no wasted stats is what you're going to need to really make that transition be like smooth and feel comfortable. Things like energy shield rings or energy shield belts or just jewels with energy shield on them will help out a lot. Okay, maybe you really want to play Manaforged arrows and you don't care about Diadem. You want to move on to Manaforged arrows. It is simpler and smoother, so I get the appeal on that front, but I think it's a lot weaker now because you can't afford the Divine Blessing support. I have 2 different possible approaches for making Manaforged arrows work. I'm going to start with one that is the result of a really good post on our channel, and I'm just going to pull that up and read it right now. Hey, one thing I just saw, mana and hybrid flasks can still roll the reduced percent mana cost of skills mod. It means you have to use a hybrid flask, but Master Surgeon will allow you to keep that up permanently. And if you want to supercharge things, there are plenty of ways to get more life recovery, like Tides of Time, Field Medicine, Scion Flask / Life Wheel, Vitality's Watcher's Eye. So the only nerf to Pathfinder is that one of your utility magic flasks now becomes a hybrid flask, but you can still use Manaforged arrows and drive all your costs to 0. So can this work? Absolutely, and I think it is a good budget approach, but it does have some limitations that I think fitting in a Divine Blessing support with this setup is very difficult, probably still impossible. All right, so let's just start by looking at the flask mods, the flask effects, and it's true, there is a suffix for mana and hybrid flasks. It is a suffix with relatively low weight that gives you reduced mana cost of skills, and that can actually go above the old 25% number. There are some prefixes available. The one that you will have to run, because you're going to be sitting at or around full mana pretty much all the time, and you're going to certainly be bouncing back up to full mana as soon as you hit a mana flask, you will have to run this prefix. Reduced amount recovered, effect is not removed when unreserved mana is filled, effect is not Q. So it'll wind up working just like your life flask, where you have a flask that you have to hit every 5 seconds or so in order to maintain it permanently. Now, as for hybrid flasks, I did craft some of those. The problem with them is that just like using a mana flask when you're at full mana, it won't do anything. The same is true, like I'll even show it off here, right? Here's a mana flask. Okay, I'm pressing 4. That's what I have it keybound to. It's not doing anything. You can hear me hitting my keys. Okay, so we can make it so that life flasks will work when you're at full health and mana flasks will work when you're at full health. The problem is that for life flasks, you have to have one of these suffixes like grant immunity to bleeding, grant immunity to poison, whatever, and we're using the suffix, the one suffix that's on the flask, to reduce our mana cost, so we can't do that. So that means that a hybrid flask is possibly an option, but if we compare the charges, it's 15 out of 45 for a life flask. That's pretty easy to compensate for because we can make our life flask last for so long. Hybrid is a little bit more difficult. 20 out of 40, like I have one here with that same prefix. It's usable when your mana is full. It won't fall off. And like I'll just tap it. You'll see basically what I'm going to say here is that I am out consuming what I'm regenning, which for a modifier like reduces your mana, that is like build enabling. So it's build disabling to have it fall off. So basically a hybrid flask won't work, and that's okay. You won't be able to maintain 100% uptime on a hybrid flask, so you wouldn't want to replace your life flask with a hybrid flask in order to do this. You'd lose out on like corrupted blood immune. You would lose out on, on having permanent uptime on that flask. I mean, you can see here, like it's about to fall off, and I don't think I'll have enough. Yeah, see, it's off. It's just gone. So several seconds where I wasn't able to attack because I didn't have that flask active. That's not going to work, right? So that's okay. We can fix that by running mana flasks, and I have crafted up a mana flask. I didn't have any mana flasks in my stash to play around with in game, and that's okay because this is something I've done in the past. This is something I remember doing like literally quite a few years ago, running one of these mana flasks that has the effect is not removed when unreserved mana is filled prefix, and then reduce mana cost of skills as a suffix. Like that is a thing you can do, and you can maintain 100% uptime on it. Like the amount of charges you need to maintain a mana flask is very, very low. It's like 7 charges, as we can see here, 7 charges every 6.5 seconds. Very easy to sustain that. We don't even need the Tides of Time. Now, hypothetically, if we were going to use a hybrid flask and actually use that to replace our life flask and just like deal with bleed in some other way, the Tides of Time maybe could get us to the hump where we're able to permanently maintain hybrid flask instead of a regular life flask. Maybe that would work. We would lose a massive amount. Like we could show that off. We go from the insane like 3,000 life per second down to about 500 because life and hybrid flask don't stack. Like if we turn off the hybrid flask, no change. So we have to use a mana flask in order to make this work, and that means it specifically needs to be, even though this is on a hybrid flask, the same mods would be there. It would need specifically to be this prefix only and this suffix only. And it would need to be a high-level version of this suffix because this Ascendancy node right here, Nature's Boon, which had a really positive effect with like utility flasks that had reduced mana cost of skills, it would add another 30% effect onto them. That applies to magic utility effects. Mana flasks, hybrid flasks. They are mana flasks or hybrid flasks. They are not utility flasks, unfortunately. So we lose a lot of effect, and that is why we are more than likely not able to fit in a Divine Blessing support. Like, I have set this up here. As you can see, I have maximum effect on this hybrid flask, 29% reduced mana cost of skills. We are using the Tides of Time. We're doing everything we possibly can to reduce the cost here, and I have a Divine Blessing support. It doesn't matter what you're supporting with Divine Blessing. It could be anything, right? Vitality. The mana cost is going to be the same. So at level 1, with a 21 inspiration with 20 quality, the cost is about 32, and I have 35 unreserved mana, and this is at like level 99 character level. So if we even just go up to like level 10 on the Divine Blessing support, we can't cast that Divine Blessing anymore. So that reduces a lot of the effect. If we were to use this for like Malevolence or something, it reduces both the effect and the duration. Now, mana is not going to be a concern, right? Because we have a mana flask running, so we can press it, consume all of our mana with like a level 5 Divine Blessing support, and then instantly regen our mana and be able to function. So I think that that still works and it's okay. But it's tight. Like, it may be a situation where you're just not able to use the Divine Blessing support at all, or maybe you are and it's doable, but it is tight. The issue here is that you aren't able to automate a mana flask or a hybrid flask in any way. You have to hit them. So now, instead of hitting just your life flask every so often, you also have to hit your life and mana flask. You have to hit 2 different flasks fairly often. This means that you're giving up one of your other utility flasks as well, and the suffixes that go along with that. So you probably want to keep stun immunity and you want to keep attack speed, but then you have to think about the way that you're fixing ailment immunity. So you might, if you're trying to use a Storm Shroud and shock immunity, that wouldn't be possible through this. If you're trying to fit in some unique flasks like Progenesis or Taste of Hate, that gets a little sketchier. You probably have to give up, I think, Quicksilver Flask, unfortunately, is what you would have to give up in this situation, and that is kind of a bummer because that'll really slow you down. So if you're trying to fit in like Life Flask, Mana Flask, Taste of Hate, Topaz Flask, and Silver Flask, I think that can work, but it is definitely a pretty significant limitation. I should take a look here. I just want to show off here also the mana cost of Toxic Rain with the hybrid flask going. As we can see, without it, it's 18 per cast. With it going, it's 2. Now that is also assuming that I'm running one of these. This mastery right here, skills cost life instead of 30% of mana cost, which is pretty fittable, pretty affordable. But if we drop that, then we would need to do some other stuff. Basically just prefix non-channeling skills have minus mana cost. As you can see, I only have one of those active. I don't even have a ring on right now with this. So it's something that you could play around with, how many of those prefixes you want to run versus how good of an effect you're getting on this flask. Another thing I want to emphasize here in Craft of Exile just real quickly is how hard it is to make one of these bad boys at a high level. If I can get this Chrome tab to work here. Okay, so we're gonna make a mana flask with, there's only one tier of the don't fall off when you hit full mana prefix, and it has a decent weight, 3k. It's basically the same weight as everything else, so that's all right. And then we really want tier 1 on the reduced mana cost of skills. Now maybe you could go with tier 2, but I really would prefer to have tier 1. So alting our way to this, it's not really that difficult. It's something that, like, within the first week of a league, you're gonna have more than enough alts to be able to put this together. But like during the initial push right out of the campaign, you're not gonna be sitting on 600 alts. So even if we were to drop this down to like rank 2, 300 alts, I think this puts you around the same level of availability as the old Veiled Crafting mod. You know, you're gonna have to actually alt spam, or maybe alt and aug spam your way to getting this, which is a bit annoying, but you did have to kill Katarina before, like potentially multiple times. Potentially you had to unveil a ton of flasks. I definitely have been down that road in the past where I've unveiled like 10 flasks and still not gotten the mana cost suffix mod. So like, I mean, as much as this nerf is kind of like, it's definitely required some rethinking, and it's been unfortunate, like not having to deal with that again, buying like 10, like a dozen Cinder Swallow urns to no avail. You know, it's kind of, they're saving me from that big inconvenience. So not all bad. So the issue here is that even if you are able to roll like the higher mod, the 29% reduced mana cost of skills during effect, that's a higher number than the old 25%. But because the old 25% was a utility flask, it was getting that 30% increased effect. It is still stronger than this, even at the best possible roll. Okay, so with all of these limitations, is this setup still worth playing? I think it absolutely can be. I am more comfortable with the Eldritch Battery setup than this, having to hit both life and mana flask consistently all the time. And you are still going to start out by using Eldritch Battery until you can get a perfect mana flask rolled anyways. So like in order to enable this setup. So, I mean, right, you're going to play Eldritch Battery at some point in the process either way, and that's fine. The downside of having to hit Mana Flask fairly frequently, in addition to the Life Flask, is enough to scare me off of this setup. I think the appeal of Manaforged Arrows is the smoothness and the easiness it provides compared to the Eldritch Battery setup, and because you can't automate Mana Flask, you are basically doing an even trade of like one inconvenience for another. But I think the Mana Flask inconvenience is more intrusive than dropping Ballista Totem supports to kill map bosses and pesky rares. You also maybe can't run that Divine Blessing support. Maybe you can, but it's really tight to fit in. Like as you see, I dropped the life cost instead of 30% of mana cost mastery, and then now I come over to the Divine Blessing support. And even at level 1, it's too expensive. It's significantly too expensive. So that is absolutely mandatory instead of like an option for fixing mana. That becomes completely mandatory for this setup if you're trying to fit in any sort of Divine Blessing. With all of these downsides being said, this isn't all that expensive to get rolling, right? It's like 600 alts to roll up the flask yourself. You might be able to buy one that's well rolled for cheap if somebody has picked it up and doesn't exactly know what they have and they're just trying to sell it off. It will work. So if you like this version of the build and you're willing to jump through the hoop of keeping your mana flask up all the time, this is an approach that will work and get you pretty close to the same version as the old build. Now, I also have a much more expensive version that doesn't require a mana flask, and the upside of having super smooth gameplay is still there. The big problem with it is that it is going to be expensive. So let's run through that now. So I have a setup here for high budget clarity, meaning like mana, no Eldritch Battery. I also have a skill set that has clarity in it. And I have some in-game trees that would not use Eldritch Battery, so you wouldn't be going up into the top half of the tree and doing stuff to increase your energy shield. You also have to give up an aura, and I think the one that makes clearly the most sense is Purity of Elements. So you have to say goodbye to that Purity Watcher's Eye, and that means you lose some Fizz to Ellie conversion, so that does actually make you less tanky. And also it makes this more expensive because the Watcher's Eye that you're going to be using instead is the non-channeling skills have -10 to total mana cost while affected by clarity. The range on that roll is -5 to -10. You do want it to be 10, so you might need to buy one that has a bad roll and slap divines on it. Now, I could be mistaken. Maybe these will be incredibly cheap in the coming league. I doubt it. These have usually been pretty expensive, and given that there is a flask nerf in this patch, I think they're going to be in really high demand, and I think they're going to be insanely expensive. This also means you need to run clarity, so you need to find a way to get a lot of mana reservation efficiency, either from your helm, like running both as an Eldritch implicit, and also as a suffix from essences. And you probably want to use a Thread of Hope in the middle of the tree here so that you can pick up Potency of Will and the 2 small nodes next to it, and then that way you can anoint Sovereignty onto your amulet, and that will give you the ability to have enough mana reservation efficiency to still run the trifecta of Haste, Grace, and Malevolence without needing a level 4 Enlighten. And then you can still fit in Clarity with that. That'll put you pretty tight on mana, but you'll be able to pull it off. In order to get your mana costs low enough for this build to work, you will also need at least a Grand Ember Eldritch Implicit reduced mana cost of attacks roll on your helm. That would be 24% reduced cost. If you can use Orbis of Conflict on your helm to roll that up to an even higher tier and get 26% reduced or 28% reduced, that is ideal. You also need the minus mana cost prefix rolls on your rings, 1 ring, 2 ring, and your amulet. You also need to get these items catalysted up. It's a lot. Clearly, it's a lot. You're trying to get the mana cost of Toxic Rain down to 1 or 2 mana per cast. Now, depending on how you have your Manaforged arrows set up, I kind of prefer to just go with more of a utility setup. So we run like Toxic Rain of Withering, we only run like 3 supports, and then we run Frenzy and Ensnaring Arrow, and so all of their relative mana costs are low. If you want your Manaforged arrow setup to be specifically a damage setup, you would run like 5, you would basically just run another Toxic Rain setup, except instead of Mirage Archer, you would run like Void Manipulation, Vicious Barrage, Efficacy, and then you would probably need to run Life Tap support, because Manaforged Arrows has a 200% cost and reservation multiplier on it. So if you're just running things in like a 4-link, you know, Toxic Rain with Manaforged Arrows and Culling Strike, and then GMP really so that Frenzy has greater multiple projectiles going on, then the mana cost is still going to be 0. It's fine. But if you're trying to run it as a damage setup, it'll actually cost more than Toxic Rain. It'll cost a lot more, and so it'll only trigger like every 6 or 7 shots. You might only be triggering the Manaforged Arrow support like every 3 or 4 seconds. So that is the reason for needing that life tap support in it if you're trying to run it as a full-fledged damage setup. That will cost you some health. All right, so obviously we are costing life instead of 30% of our mana cost. We are using all of the minus mana cost things that we can on our jewelry, and we are using a Clarity Watcher's Eye, and we are using reduced mana cost of attacks as a helm implicit. I think if that were the end of the things, that would actually be okay. I would say this is not so bad. Do this, transition out of Diadem into this. I think it would be worth it. Unfortunately, we still now need to compensate for turning off Purity of Elements. So that means we need about 120 more total elemental resistance or so to make that up, but we can get that on gear. It just makes gearing tighter. I would say fixing resistances while keeping your like int high enough is probably the hardest part of gearing here. The second part is fixing elemental ailment immunity. We can use Storm Shroud, this jewel right here, which gives us a modifier and a chance to avoid being shocked, applies to all elemental ailments. And then we can use a flask that gives us a chance to avoid being shocked, a Bog Boss flask. This is a pretty classic combo, and then we combine that with this wheel right here, Thick Skin, which gives us 8% from it, and then 4% from each of the 3 small nodes for a combined total of 20% chance to avoid elemental ailments. And then because of all the flask effect that we get, I think that does the job for us. We can come over to the Calcs tab, scroll all the way down to ailment avoidance here, and we are at 103% chance to avoid 103% chance to avoid shock. So you don't need a perfect roll on your shock avoid flask. You don't really even need all that close, but 40 something percent, like 45, 48% or better, I think will do the trick. And then the 20% to avoid shock, it also carries over to everything else. So there you go. You are able to avoid all ailments by using a Storm Shroud. You can also use an Ancestral Vision. That will require crafting boots that have an implicit on them that gives you elemental ailment avoidance, and then that will combine with Thick Skin to give you, which gives you 20%. Ancestral Vision will give you elemental ailment avoidance based on 50% of your suppression. So depending on, your suppression is going to be 100. So that's 50% right there. And then 20% from Thick Skin. So you need to compensate with at least 30% ailment avoidance on your boots. Depending on the relative cost of Ancestral Vision and Storm Shroud, the state of your boots, and everything else you've juggled with your gear, right? Either of these can work. I think Storm Shroud's usually more expensive, but not necessarily always. Basically, these are 2 correct answers to the same problem. So what would I recommend? I think that the normal league start approach of going with Eldritch Battery while leveling and then just kind of sticking with it through your Void Stones makes the most sense. I'm going to farm Betrayal as my first league mechanic of choice because I want to see how rewarding it is now that Scarabs have been redesigned, and I want a Devouring Diadem, and I really don't want to have to pay for it. I want to just get it myself. I think Diadem is going to be very sought after this league because of the mana changes and because of how much it trivializes them. So I think that farming Diadems and selling them probably without unveiling them first is going to be a big money-making strategy. That's certainly one of my approaches that I'm going to be trying in the coming league. I am planning to take the Diadem setup all the way through the entire end game. We're talking, Uber Elder, Maven, probably Uber bosses as well. I will probably use my chest 4 or 5 link setup with Ballista totems for like taking down the Watchstone bosses initially, and then I will switch over to using Caustic Arrow with Arrow Nova for smooth clearing in maps instead of the Ballistas once I have gotten the build rolling and I'm doing like in-game farm. One thing to be sure about, make sure you are using Culling Strike on the Ballistas if you are using them on a 5 link and you're using them like you're killing actual bosses. Coal is really, really valuable to have there. With Caustic Arrow, I feel like this build is really good for any League mechanic, even the ones like Legion that in the past I've always said that like Toxic Rain can't really handle Legion all that well because Toxic Rain has such a small radius and you have to like really spread it around a lot to kill all the Legion mobs. I think Caustic Arrow just completely fixes that. And that's really, really awesome. So doing Legion Jun becomes a realistic possibility. It might actually be my approach once I've gotten the 4 Void Stones set up. I don't know, I'll have to see. I think it's gonna shred Breach and shred Ritual, although I don't know how great either of those is gonna be at League start. We'll need to learn more about Scarabs before we can really judge anything. I really want to get that Uber Shaper belt. I want to double corrupt them until I get increased skill effect duration or attack speed to replace that awful armor and evasion implicit modifier. And I think there's really only one other thing that affects Toxic Rain Pathfinder in the coming League. Because Hillock no longer grants increased quality to items in his safe house, you will need to use Perfect's fossils on your Thicket Bow before crafting it up. I guess you probably also want to roll up good flasks and then use Vol Orbs on them and try to get your quality up. That really doesn't sound all that fun to me, but you know, I guess that's an intended gameplay loop now too. Yeah, initially I wasn't sure if I would go this route or not, but going back and playing with an old build that had a diadem and seeing how it feels now, it is completely legit. This is the way forward 100%. I feel very confident in my League start now. I was shook for like 10 seconds when I first read the flask changes. I was like, oh no, what do I do? And then I just remembered this and I was like, oh yeah, everything's gonna be fine. We'll just go back to the way we're just going back in time. We'll go back to the way things were. It'll be fine. You know, honestly, if anything, it might be smoother than the current play style where you are reliant on getting all of your mana kind of lined up. You basically just slap on Devouring Diadem and then everything's fixed. It's pretty good. All right, that's it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.